We've been doing a series, 10 Steps Towards Spiritual Maturity. I want to continue that tonight, and Aaron and I didn't plan it, but the song, two songs before the sermon, Sanctuary. That's really what this is all about, is, in the song we sing, "O Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true." And that's the idea here, is growing into spiritual maturity, that we may be a sanctuary for the Lord, set apart, sanctified, holy for His glory. This is part 7 of our series, is avoiding envy. We want to try to overcome a challenge like many of the other ones. Again, you have your individual ones that will be more of a challenge to you. I have mine that will be more of a challenge to me. Some are common to some people. But this is something that is, it becomes a problem sometimes. I want to break this down a few different ways. I'll give our slide here that we've used. This is all about spiritual maturity and controlling ourselves, having reign over your spirit. He that ruleth his spirit is mighty. One who takes a city, Proverbs 16:32. Slow to anger, better than the mighty. If you have no rule over your own spirit, it's like a city that's broken down and without walls. So we want to work on overcoming or avoiding envy. Now, let's look at this first of all and ask the question, what is envy? You may be thinking, what a silly question to ask. Everybody knows what envy is. But there comes to the word jealousy that we want to notice, because you'll see this different ways in scriptures. I struggle with how to arrange this one, because knowing that I'm covering this, and we're going to do a series of lessons that we'll spread them out throughout the year, but I want to do a series of lessons looking at the works of the flesh as well as the fruits of the Spirit. That'll also be a Sunday night series, but one of the works of the flesh is envying. So I thought, okay, so I gotta figure this out. I don't want to just preach the same sermon. Although it's several months down the road, I could probably do that, and I wouldn't remember it, and y'all wouldn't either probably. But I've tried to think, okay, how do I want to approach that one versus how do I want to approach this one? And there may still end up being some overlap. I'm sure there will, but I want to look at this from the standpoint of what is envy, because there are actually two different words in the New Testament that are translated jealousy or envy. In the Old Testament, there are actually two words. They're more related. So let's begin with that. Hebrew word, I've had this same Bible software that I've used. It's just a cheap Bible software, but it gets the job done for me. I mostly use my Bible software probably more than anything, but more than anything, I use it for copying and pasting verses. Sometimes I will use it for a word study like this, to find a word. How many times is it used in the Old Testament or New Testament or whatever? I just learned today I could copy and paste Hebrew or Greek text. So isn't that neat and impressive? I've been learning Hebrew, studying the word. I just copied and pasted it. But Hebrew is so odd to pronounce, or at least odd to us. But sometimes they'll have like a pronunciation, and that word, it looks to us something like kinah, and they've got it pronounced something like kinal. But it's 43 times in 41 verses. It's from another word that you see sometimes actually translated with the English word envy, at least in the King James. But it's basically jealousy and or envy. And I've got a note here that there's a slightly different usage in the New Testament. That's what makes more of a distinction between jealousy and envy. And what I want to do, I'm going to read a few of these verses, and I'll read them kind of bang, bang, and then make some comments. Proverbs 3, verse 31. Our study for spiritual maturity has been kind of based in the book of Proverbs, but we expand from there with New Testament application, of course. Proverbs 3:31, envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. Don't envy the oppressor. Proverbs 23:17, let not thine heart envy sinners, but be thou in the fear of the Lord all day long. Proverbs 24, verse 1, be not thou envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them. So you can already see probably from this, it's taking more of the idea of probably what we would call jealousy. And again, you'll see a distinction a little bit more when we talk about it under New Testament usage. That's kind of how the Old Testament word tends to go. It tends to be used more that way in the Old Testament. Don't look at sinners, wicked people, the wise man says, and wish, boy, I wish I could be like that. That would probably, like I said, be more what we would call jealousy. Now, Proverbs 24, 17 through 19 gets a little bit into what we would call envy. He says, 3 verses here, rejoice not when thine enemy falleth, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbleth, lest the Lord see it, and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him. Fret not thyself because of evil men, neither be thou envious at the wicked. So it kind of a little bit more like envy, and then it goes back to that, that typical Old Testament usage that we see more often in the Old Testament. Psalm 37, verse 1. This is getting over into the Psalms, obviously, but fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. Same type of usage there. Psalm 73, I'll give you actually verses 2 and 3. The psalmist says, as for me, my feet were almost gone. My steps had well nigh slipped, for I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. So he began to be jealous, perhaps even to the point of envy, at the wicked because he sees their prosperity. Now he's going to go on in that psalm and say, then I went to the house of the Lord. Then I worshiped, and I realized that there's an end of the wicked, and it's very sudden. It involves a lot of calamity and so on. He goes on, and that's a very interesting psalm to study because it's something that happens a lot today. People are envious at sinners, but you need to stop and consider beyond just right here and right now. So again, you can see, I think, from that there's a slightly different usage. Now, there are other examples. Those are just a few. I chose those because they're from Proverbs and some very close references, closely related references in Psalms. In fact, we'll look at one of the slides we're going to look at are examples of envy. And you'll see where this word in those instances is used more like how it would be used in the New Testament. But here, at least in Proverbs for the most part, it's a slightly different usage, but I think you can still see that concept. Now in the Greek, it's the word phthonos. It means jealousy. That is the idea of jealousy out of spite or to the point of spite, ill will, envy. I don't know if I mentioned that kinal word is used 43 times in 41 verses. 2 verses, it's used twice. This word phthonos in the New Testament is used 9 times in 9 verses, just once in each of those verses. And, again, it carries this idea of ill will, envy, jealousy. Here are the 9 verses. I won't read all those because some of them we'll cover a little bit later on. We talk about some examples of envy. But every single time in these verses, with the exception of Philippians 1:15, which is noted, it's envy or envyings or envying, something like that, but something involving envy as the root word. Philippians 1:15 is strife, and again, we'll get to that one in a little bit. But 9 times in 9 verses, this word. And there is a distinction, but I want to notice this first. What produces envy? Well, it's our lust, our desires. I want to go and look at James 4 together. Let's turn over there. We could park here. In fact, I debated just preaching from James 4, and I may end up doing that when we get to it, talking about it from the works of the flesh, because you could stop here and just about preach expositorily from these first few verses of James and cover envy pretty well. But it's interesting because he talks about this coming on the heels of, in chapter 3, and by the way, we've pointed this out numerous times, chapter breaks are not in the original. There are no verse delineations in the original. It's a letter. And so he's been talking about a wise man endued with knowledge among you. He says, watch out if you've got bitter envying and strife. This is the end of chapter 3, verse 14, 13 and 14. If you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not, lie not against the truth. This wisdom's not from above, but it's earthly, sensual, devilish. It's just like the devil. For where envying and strife is, there's confusion in every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. Then he says, right on the heels of that, from whence come wars and fightings among you? He's talking about peace and harmony and goodwill. And then he kind of shifts gears. He says, but you don't have that. These brethren to whom he's writing, they didn't have that. He says, where are all these divisions coming from? Come they not hence, even of your lusts, that war in your members? You lust and have not. You kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Yet you fight in war, yet you have not, because you ask not. You ask and receive not, because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts. And then he, as James often does in this book, he gets pretty strong with them, doesn't he? Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? But he giveth more grace. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. And of course he goes on and says, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Draw nigh to God. He'll draw nigh to you. When you put this, where do envyings come from, or where does envy come from? It comes from our desires. And as we begin to understand this word and the concept more, that'll make more sense as well if it doesn't already. You put that together with James 1, 14 and 15, where he's talking about lust and temptation. You know, he says in verse 13, let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Somebody says, well, God tempted Abraham not to sin. The word there means he tested Abraham. There's a big difference. God doesn't tempt anyone to sin, as if dangling something out in front of you, saying, see if he'll take the bait. What about Job? Somebody says, Satan did that. God allowed that to prove a point to the devil. But God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And he goes on and says in verse, 15. Then when lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin. It's like planting a seed. And when the seed begins to grow, every seed produces after its kind. And so when lust sprouts, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, literally could be translated when it is full grown. So you plant this cucumber seed and it sprouts. And when it's full grown, you're not going to get tomatoes or watermelons or whatever you get. So when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. Sin, when it is full grown, bringeth forth death. What produces envy? It comes from our desires. They're not always sinful desires in and of themselves, by the way. And you know, sometimes there's some situations where the desire itself is not wrong. It's the extent to which we take it. And again, that'll make more sense as we go along. What does envy produce? Well, if nothing else, it produces a sin in thought. I may just seethe with envy and never tell anybody. What's the harm, right? Well, Jesus makes it pretty clear in Matthew 12 and Mark 7, other places, Matthew 15, that all sin begins in the heart. In fact, in that context, particularly Matthew 15 and Mark 7, there's some Pharisees that are upset with Jesus and his disciples because they're not going through this ritualistic washing of the hands, and you're unclean when you eat. And he says, it's not eating with unwashed hands that makes a man defiled. And it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, it's what comes out. He says it is what's in the heart. It makes its way out into action and words. That's what defiles a man. And so Proverbs 23:7, I mentioned that because the word there, he says, that I was looking for make sure I get the wording right. I had it on my list here. As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. So as you think in your heart, so are you. We talked about this, Proverbs 4:23. I think it was in the last lesson we did on this series. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. From it spring the issues of life. So what does envy produce? Well, it produces sin and thought, even if you don't say anything to anybody. In other words, my point there being just, I shouldn't be content, well, I don't tell anybody about my envy, so what's the big deal? It's still a big deal. And what's in the heart eventually will find its way out into action anyway. Proverbs 14:30. This is a key verse when you talk about this. A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy is what? Rottenness of the bones. It is like a cancer eating you up, not in a physical way, but in a mental, emotional, spiritual kind of way. It can even get to the point that it affects physical health. We already read James 3:13 through 18 and saw what it produces there. You know, he says, you could even back up earlier in chapter 3 where he talks about, does a fig tree bring forth olive berries there in verse 12? Either a vine, figs. No fountain brings forth salt water and fresh. Bitter, envying, strife. He says, don't lie against the truth, so it produces lying, sometimes just lying to self, if nothing else. It's wisdom that is not heavenly, it's earthly, sensual, devilish, might even say demonic. Where envying and strife is, there's confusion and every evil work. Sorry. My mom knows what time Bremen starts. I think they're doing it online only. Don't tell her I said that. It's not every day you're just preaching away, you know, and you get a phone call. Happened a few weeks ago, it was Miss Jeanette calling me. So, but anyway, now it's Mom. I don't know. I need, who was the fellow in a press conference recently, and he answered somebody's phone. It was maybe a coach or somebody. Anyways, I should give it to Brother Chris. Can you tell Mom I'm busy? I'm not going to tell her. So, where did we leave off? That startled me. I was like, what? Somebody's calling me. Envy, it produces, yes, the wisdom that's not from above. It's earthly, sensual, devilish. So that's the produce of envy. And I think this is where I've got a note in my PowerPoint to make sure I didn't forget. Yes, want to distinguish it from jealousy. And I know I don't do this a whole lot, and I guess that's could be good or bad depending on how you look at it. But there are several things. I just found some really good quotes from different writers pertinent to this particular subject. Socrates, by the way, describes envy this way: envy is the filthy slime of the soul, a venom, a poison, or quicksilver which consumeth the flesh and drieth up the marrow of the bones. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says envy comes from the Latin word invideo, in, against, and video, to look with ill will toward another. Is an evil condemned in both the Old and New Testaments. It is distinguished from jealousy. And that's where the ISBE stops. And I thought to myself, okay, it's distinguished from jealousy. So what if a person wants to know how? Well, like I said, I found this really good quote from a brother he's long left this side of eternity. But J. Noel Meredith is his name. He says this, and man, this is tremendous. The word envy etymologically means to look with ill will. We notice that from ISBE, or to look against. By definition, envy is chagrin or discontent at the excellence or good fortune of another. Resentful, begrudging. Jealousy and envy are to be distinguished in the following manner. Here's what we're trying to get to, right? We are jealous of our own. A husband may be jealous toward his wife, or vice versa. God is often described how? I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. There's a context in which jealousy is not a bad thing. The Greek word, in fact, is zelos. Sounds a lot like zealous. In fact, sometimes it's translated that way. We'll get to that when we get to that under the works of the flesh. We're jealous of our own. We are envious of another man's possessions or good fortune. I think that's a good distinction to make. I've heard it said before, and I've even made the statement before myself, and I think it's still true, but I think there's a good distinction there that Brother Meredith makes. I've also heard a distinction made that jealousy is, you see something and, maybe somebody has a new toy, new vehicle, whatever it may be, new job, and you think, man, I wish that happened to me. Well, is that inherently bad? No. But if you think, well, why should he get that? I mean, better than he is. Should have been me. That gets into jealousy. But then gets a promotion, and I start thinking, well, it should have been me. In fact, you know what? Maybe I need to tell the boss about something. I've seen him kind of slacking around, not doing what he's supposed to do. I think I need to go let somebody know, and maybe they'll just bump him down, and then they'll see that it's me that should get this. Now I'm going to start. It's not just wanting what is not rightfully mine. It is to the point that I'm going to try to harm another in order to obtain it. But I also like this distinction of Brother Meredith, that we're jealous of our own, envious of another man's possession or good fortune. Jealousy fears to, I'm continuing this quote here, by the way. Jealousy fears to lose what it has. Envy is pained at seeing another have. Very good distinction there as well. In setting forth the sins that come from within, out of the heart of man, Jesus lists in Mark 7:21 and 22, an evil eye. An evil eye is one of those that he lists there in Mark 7. The Revised Standard Version translates the passage envy. It literally translates, if you're looking in the Greek, it's the word for evil, and it's the word for eye. He's obviously not talking about a physical eye. Your eye is just, when you're dead and gone, it's gonna break down and go back to the dust. What does he mean then? It's a look of ill will. And so I like that idea of the RSV translating it envy. That certainly is the concept, at least. The sin of envy, he says, Brother Meredith continues, is indeed the evil eye. A couple other quotes here that I ran across. William Barclay. This kind of goes under what we're talking about. What produces envy? Sometimes it's just the success of another person, right? I mean, you can take two people in the Lord's church, brothers, and let one have something really good happen. And here I am sitting next to him, and maybe the same thing doesn't happen to me. In fact, maybe I'm going through tremendous suffering, difficulty, trial, and it becomes a severe test of Christian character and integrity and maturity, which is what we're talking about in this series. William Barclay says this: maybe it is true to say that there is no better test of a man than his reaction to the greatness and to the success of someone else. If it moves him to the zealous, noble ambition to goodness, that is the work of the Spirit. But if it moves him to a bitter and envious resentment, and that's the phonos we're talking about here, that is the work of the flesh, and what ought to be a spur to goodness has become a persuasion to sin. Brother T.W. Brents said this: there is a trait or characteristic implanted in men by the Lord for good and laudable purposes in order to excite to worthwhile attainments and to stir one to imitate the good and noble in others. This principle is called emulation. Its purpose is to excite us to greater achievements, but when it meets with a corrupt and rebellious disposition, it degenerates into that most malignant passion in man's nature, the most obnoxious weed of the poorest soil called envy. Man, that is so true, isn't it? Got to keep our hearts out of it are the issues of life. All right, moving on. Let's notice next some examples of envy. Just don't have time to, go and unpack each one of these greatly. I will say this: I think probably the vast majority of these are familiar, so that should be okay. Cain and Abel. We all know about Cain and Abel, right? Genesis 4. Cain brings his offering from the fruit of the ground. Abel brings the best of his flocks, and Abel's offering is accepted. Cain's is not. And Cain, instead of making, and in fact, he's even confronted by God and says, why are you so upset? If you do right, you'll be accepted. But if not, sin lies at the door. And instead of making that right, in fact, going back to Brother Brent's quote there, when it meets with a corrupt and rebellious disposition, degenerates into that most malignant passion in a man's nature, the most obnoxious weed of the poorest soil called envy. That's what happened. He began to be envious of Abel and led him to, you and I know the end of that account. He ended up killing his brother, right? And so Cain became so envious that he killed Abel. Another example from Genesis, Joseph's brothers, Genesis 37. Joseph goes to check on them. He's had these dreams. He tells his brothers about them. Oh, look, here comes the dreamer. And they're so envious of him, perhaps because of the dreams, probably as much or more so because of Jacob's favoritism toward Joseph, the coat of many colors, you recall. They're going to kill him. Then they decide, well, we could make some money off of him if we sell him into slavery. So they sell him into slavery. Acts chapter 7, verse 9 says, tells us there, as if we didn't know it already. We did know it, of course. But, it spells it out there. The patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. They were envious of Joseph, and it led them to hurt him. Think about Miriam and Aaron, Numbers 12. They're envious toward Moses. He's married this Ethiopian woman, and they're envious of his position, no doubt, and so they rebel, and they are punished for that. Right? Another example, just right there, almost in the same context, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, Numbers chapter 16. Oh, you take too much upon you, Moses, they try to say. They're covering up their envy. They try to put it under a noble banner, right? As if, well, you're just taking too much upon yourself. What it really came down to was they were envious of Moses. King Saul, 1 Samuel 18, 7 through 9. Oh, the ladies start to sing, and they say, Saul has killed his thousands, but David's killed his 10,000s. And Saul says, well, what else is left for him but to have the kingdom, the throne? And you know what verse 9 says of 1 Samuel 18? From that day forward, Saul eyed David. You remember the roots of that Greek word phthonос? And how Jesus uses that term evil eye that the RSV translates envy in Mark 7. What was the reference? 21 maybe? I just lost it. 7, 21, and 22. Saul eyed David. He's got an evil eye on him, that eye of envy. Another example in Scripture, Haman. I got Esther 3 and Esther 5, really just about put the whole book. He's so envious of Haman and determines he wants to just exterminate not just Haman, but all the Jews. Of course, that came back to bite him. He ended up reaping what he sowed in a very literal way. But it all came down to envy. Just couldn't stand to see anything good happening to Haman, simply because Haman would not what? Bow down to him. Just, Mordecai. Thank you. Sorry. Appreciate that, Jacob. How many times did I say Haman in there, Jacob? Somebody had to do something, right? Mordecai. Sorry. Haman was envious of Mordecai. Y'all knew that. You know these already. Apologize for that. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here. The Jews in Jesus' day, they were also envious. In fact, I mentioned we'd kind of come back to some of those references earlier. Matthew 27, 18 and Mark 15, 10, very similar verses. They're parallel passages. Jesus is on trial, And Pilate knows that for envy they have delivered Jesus. Oh, they say, look, here's an enemy of the state. You got to do something. Oh, were they good Romans? Were they loyal Romans? Bless them, so concerned about the state of affairs in Rome that they didn't want to see anybody rise up and challenge Caesar? No. They don't care a thing about Rome. They hate Rome. They want Jesus dead. And if that means rubbing elbows, so to speak, with Rome to make it happen, whatever. And this ties in what we'll talk about in just a moment as well. And you even had some preachers, some gospel preachers in the first century. I would submit to you, some preachers even to this very day. In Philippians 1, Paul makes this statement. I wasn't going to read this, but I want to now. Philippians 1, beginning at 15. Some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife. And the word strife there is actually our Greek word that we've been talking about, phonos. And some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds. You remember one of the definitions we gave that word was jealousy with spite. Oh, wait a minute. So Paul's in prison because he's preaching the gospel? And so, somebody maybe decides, I can make things worse on Paul. I could go running around and make sure Rome hears about it and say, I'm preaching the gospel Paul preaches. They're just doing it out of spite. They're not zealous for the gospel. They're just trying to get him in more trouble and increase his affliction. Isn't that something? I used to hear an expression all the time when I was growing up. Sometimes mom and dad would say something about somebody who would cut off their nose to spite their face. And it's an expression when you're doing something really dumb and self-harmful, you end up hurting yourself in the end. And that's kind of the situation here. It's amazing. Every time I read it, I'm just blown away. Supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but he says the other of love, knowing that I'm set for the defense of the gospel. Some of those preachers, they just preached out of envy. And you know what Paul says? You see Paul's attitude contrasted with theirs. Paul says, look, I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it's okay. I'm just glad the gospel's being preached. I think that's a pretty amazing attitude you see from Paul there. All right, now let's talk about some characteristics of envy. So many things I want to cover here. Envy always tries to hide its true motive, whether the goal is whether it's slander, it may be mistreatment, it could be, destruction of a good person, a good work, a good man's reputation. It may even be murder. We saw that with the Jews. You see, the Jews, in fact, they hid behind loyalty to God, right? And the law of Moses. Oh, we're loyal to God, and so we've got to get Jesus. We got to do something about this guy. They even hid behind loyalty to Rome. They'd hide behind loyalty to God, to the religious people. To the Romans, they'd hide behind loyalty to Rome. It was all for one purpose, to get rid of the object of their envy. You got envy, it'll often fly under false color, false flag. So it's no surprise to see that it's mimicking the father of lies, the devil. He's the father of all lies, John 8:44. But also he can transform himself into an angel of light. And that's not a passage saying that the devil can literally transform himself into an angel of light. What the passage there is saying is he's deceitful. He's not going to come up to you and tell you, I'm the devil. And, you have these songs, the devil went down to Georgia, and you've got these the television shows where the devil comes up. I want to make a deal with you. Sell your soul to me, and we'll have this deal. Man, come on. The devil's not stupid. He's not going to do that. He's going to come to you looking innocent and looking helpful and harmless and benign. He's going to disguise himself. That's what 2 Corinthians 11:14 is telling us, and that's what happens all too often with envy. In its lies, envy might even purport to save the church. I have seen this happen even among preachers. Preachers are as susceptible to this one as anybody. Sometimes they get envious. Here's another brother, and he's really he's doing a great work, and it's easy to see that and think, Well, what's wrong? Why is that not happening here? Well, there could be 100 reasons why that's not happening here. And somebody, we may experience some kind of success, and somebody may look over here, another preacher, and say, why is that not happening over here? There could be all kind of reasons why that's not happening. But sometimes we decide that there's something wrong with that guy, and I've seen it. I've seen it happen. I've even experienced it, at least to some extent, and as far as being a target of it, where somebody just, and I guess, I don't know if it was envy or not, but this mentality of we're going to save the church from all these people that are going to wreck it or ruin it or destroy it. Sometimes envy will do that. I like what E.A. Elam says. Here's a quote that he mentions. One envies in others that which one aspires to be. I've found myself, when I had to do a self-examination, 2 Corinthians 13:5, I found, like anybody else, there have been times when I've been guilty of envy. And it's true. You envy what you aspire to be. Goes on and he says, a woman envies the beauty and charms of other women. A man envies the grace and courage of other men. A farmer does not envy the physician or lawyer, but his fellow farmers. Physicians envy physicians. Lawyers envy lawyers. Preachers envy preachers. Politicians envy politicians. The man who makes some money envies other men who make more, and thus it goes. I believe I've got this on here. The object or objects of the envying, more often than not, most often have not done them, the one doing the envying, they've not done any harm to that person. It's not like this is a revenge type situation or retribution type situation. You think about Abel. What did Abel do to Cain? Nothing. What did Joseph do to his brethren? Nothing. What did Mordecai do to Haman? Nothing. What did Jesus do to those Jews? What did he do? He came down from heaven. He thought not the equality with God something to be grasped or held on to, Philippians 2. And he came down to heaven to save them. And he went to the cross for them. That's what he did. It's amazing how often the object or objects of the envying have done no harm to the one who's envying them. Over and over and over again, you see that. Envy is determined in its aim to discredit, to remove, to destroy its object. There's another thing that E.A. Elam says. Again, and worst of all, envy seeks to put out of its way the object which excites it and stoops sometimes to the lowest depths and uses the vilest means to do so, as when Joseph's brethren sold him, a weeping and clinging lad, a tender and helpless child, in their care and keeping, but also in their cruel power, into slavery and imprisonment. It is sly and sneaking, undermining and treacherous, or bold and arrogant in accomplishing its purpose. The enormity of this sin is increased when committed in the name of religion, professed loyalty to Jesus, and love for the church. And unfortunately, it happens. You see it with those Jews in Jesus' day, but it didn't end there. But listen, envy never admits. Envy will never admit, I want this person to be destroyed. They'll never admit that. And so thus we say, as we did under that second subpoint there, envy flies under false colors. It may say, I'm doing this for the sake of the church. And even in the secular realm, I'm trying to get rid of this person for the sake of the company. When a lot of times it comes down to just good old-fashioned envy. Of course, nothing good about it. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, continuing on, Brother Elam. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and their company did not say, we envy Moses and Aaron. No, they would never say that. They said, you take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and Jehovah's among them. Wherefore then lift you up yourselves above the assembly of Jehovah. There in Numbers 16, 1 through 3. They accused Moses and Aaron of doing that which Moses and Aaron did not do, but that which they themselves wanted to do and made an effort to do. They attributed, he goes on, what they undertook to do in violation of God's law to their love for the rights of the people. They're just concerned about the rights of those people. Don't you know that? No. They were envious of Moses and Aaron, and they were going to take action and do anything and everything they could to get rid of them. That's what envy does. It's going to seek to destroy, to discredit, get out of the way the object of the envy. It'll wreck health. I don't mean just physical health. It can certainly do that. But most importantly, emotional health, and of course, most importantly of all, spiritual health. It really is, Proverbs 14:30, rottenness of the bones, spiritually speaking. Let's close out with this last slide. There's actually not a whole lot here, but I just got 3 references, but they're pretty profound as far as, what is the remedy for envy? If I find myself struggling with this, what do I need to do? Some of this we saw there in the book of James. We talked about James chapter 3 and really on into chapter 4, especially on into chapter 4 where he says, verse 6, he giveth more grace. God gives more grace. He helps us to overcome these struggles. He says, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. So humility. In fact, that's the last lesson we talked about, number 6 in this series. He says, submit yourselves. There's one way to remedy envy. You got to submit yourself to God. Resist the devil. He'll flee from you. Draw nigh or near to God. He'll draw near to you. 1 Peter 2, verses 1 and 2. Verse 1 is one of the uses of this word thonos, where he says, wherefore laying aside all malice and all guile and hypocrisies and envies and all evil speakings. But there's the next verse, 1 Peter 2:2. Most of you probably can quote it. As newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word that you may grow thereby. What's one of there's a connection there to those verses, right? What are you laying aside? Well, he mentioned several things, but one of those is envies. How do I lay aside envy? Well, I got to desire and partake of the Word of God. Crave it like a newborn babe. So we would say there, the Word of God. 1 Corinthians 13:4. Again, you probably know the verse. Charity suffereth long, is kind. Charity envieth not. Vaunteth not itself, not puffed up. Well, love. Love for fellow man, but especially love for brethren. And I've mentioned several times Proverbs 4, verse 23. Keep the heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. I would add, when we're talking about in the church, by the way, before I forget, I saw another quote I wanted to mention that I'm about to forget. Brother Ira North made this statement: envy and love cannot remain in the same mind at the same time. Love cannot envy. 1 Corinthians 13:4. So you want to help remedy envy, you need love. Brother Cates mentions that, the place to stop the fruits of envy is at the little end of the taproot, in the heart. He connects that with Proverbs 4, verse 23. When it's in the church, we need to have some common sense, right? To realize the foolishness, the silliness of envy toward one another, because that's what we sometimes call, the military calls it friendly fire. They're on the same side. We need to be battling the devil and his forces, not one another. Envy, it is something that we may not think a whole lot about, may not give it a whole lot of thought, but it is a deadly, poisonous sin that truly, truly is the rottenness of the bones. I hope we're growing towards spiritual maturity. It may be an issue with envy. It may be that there's an issue with something else. It may be that somebody here is not in Christ, not a child of God, and never having rendered obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we extend heaven's invitation. You can decide, as we're going to sing, to follow Jesus tonight. But make that commitment. No turning back. No turning back. And you know what, brothers and sisters in Christ? There are times you're going to stumble along the way. There are times you may even fall and need the help of your brethren to get up. But please don't ever turn back from following. That's why God gave us the church, to strengthen each other, to help each other, to keep each other plugging along toward heaven. But may we never turn on one another with envious eyes, with an evil eye, wanting to hurt someone or to take or to have what rightfully belongs to them. Let's seek to help each other in every way that we can and together bring glory to God. Are you following Jesus? If not, we extend the invitation. If we can help you in any way, won't you decide to follow Jesus now while we stand and sing?